A very good morning, and thank you all for being here. Allow me to introduce Mr. Dilip Chenoy. He's a very exceptional person. He's a very rare combination of both an educator and an industrialist. He is somebody who knows both ends of the spectrum. He knows what it is a student should know and how a student should know to apply it, where to apply it. And he's a man with an enormous challenge in front of him. He is the CEO and the MD of the NSDC, which is the National Skill Development Corporation, and he has the stupendous task of training millions of Indians within the next 10 years. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it short. I have a huge list of things that Mr. Chenoy has done, but I'll maybe at the end of it. I invite Mr. Chenoy to please come and share with us his wisdom.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, and begin by wishing all of you a very happy New Year. I'm really humbled and privileged to be here. It's like being at home. I was introduced as Dr. Chenoy, and unfortunately, I'm the only non-PhD in the family. Being in this room is also like being at home because my son is a student, my wife, my brother, and my sister-in-law all teach in university. So the dining table is some reflection of students and teachers and professors somewhat akin to this room. I went through the program and the papers, everything that was being presented here since yesterday until tomorrow. And what I found was that there were eminent scholars, practitioners, and I thought, what would a person or a novice in this space like me contribute? So I thought, let me take the easy way out. Let me address you like a customer. And how could technology-enabled education actually mirror what MIT just presented? Okay? And here is how do we use technology to train the Indian majority. So it's a different kind of a situation. And therefore, I thought I would actually spend the next 15 minutes breaking my talk into 4 parts. Talk about the opportunity landscape. You can look at the opportunity to skill, the numbers that I'll talk about as a challenge or as an opportunity. What's actually happening in the country and what we are trying to do to bridge the skill deficit, and where technology could actually play a role. And I'd like to take you, academics and a lot of people in this space are very comfortable within the classroom. And I believe that the interventions outside the classroom are more important in the skill space compared to what's happening in the education space. So we all know that India is a country with a rich demographic dividend. It could be productively engaged, or the young kids who don't have jobs could be otherwise engaged in disrupting the economy. We have the large numbers, but we are as a country plagued by a significant challenge in terms of the large dropout rates from school, the low employability of people who graduate, and the very low level of skilled people in the ecosystem. Only about 8% of the people who work in the formal and informal sector have any opportunity to go through a skilling or a vocational training experience. There is a challenge. We would have by 2022, and a lot of people ask the question, why is India talking of 2022? The answer is very simple. Given that we got independence in August 1947, in 2022, we will be 75 years young as a nation. So when we were at 60, we said, what would you like to be at 75? And therefore, the population would be around 1.2, 1.3 billion, somewhere in between that number. There would be about 700 million people in the working age population. If the Minister of Higher Education manages to get his reforms going through, and we increase the gross enrollment ratio in the university system from 12 to 20, 200 million people of these 700 million people would be graduates. What qualifications or what skills would the balanced 500 million people have? And that's the challenge that we were trying to address. So the Prime Minister actually said that, can we set a target of skilling 500 million people by 2022? Now 500 million is an abstract number, right? But if you break it down into a day, it means 136,000 people have to be skilled every day, beginning a few years ago till 2022. And while the government system was enabling that to happen, and they said that the government system will do 350 million, they thought that they would involve the private sector to actually skill 150 million people between 2008 and 2022, which roughly translates to about 45,000 people a day. And then they entrusted this responsibility to the National Skill Development Corporation. So here we had the unique challenge of skilling 150 million people between 2008 and 2022. And you were given money to do it, and they said that it's going to cost roughly around 2,000 to 5,000 rupees to skill a person, and therefore you need to do the country needs to do around 50 million a year. That's how you get 500 million in 10 years. So it's about a $20 billion or a 1 lakh crore opportunity every year. So how does one actually reach out to people and skill people, and what's the role of technology is which I'd like to actually talk about. So yesterday, in one of the talks, I saw a slide which talked about the challenges in the vocational space. But I'd like to actually bring it down to 3 parts which are the critical kind of trinity that we need to address. The first is quantity. The current skilling capacity in India is around 4.3 million people a year. So if all the skilling, government, private sector, all these vocational schools operate at full capacity, we could skill about 4.3 million people a year today. There are 12.8 million people who enter the workforce a year as it is today. And if we want to train 500 million people in the next 10 years, we need to take this 4.3 to at least 50, if not 40, right? So we need an 8x kind of a multiplication of existing capacity. If you want to do a brick and mortar structure, it's going to take 2 to 3 years to acquire land, to build the building, and you're going to add to a backlog. So we need a model that is substantially different from what it was there in the past. We need methodology which is different than what actually has worked in the past. And it is not necessarily that the best practices around the world could be implemented in India, because the scale, size, and scope of the problem are different. The second quantity issue is that we're talking of dispersed locations. If you look at 6,000 cities or towns which account for a significant part of our GDP, and you talk of the 642,000 villages that we have, how do you actually disperse training to where the people are rather than move the people to where the training institutions are? The third is that you cannot have an ideal classroom size of 25. You'll have small batches. How do you actually get teachers and the curriculum out to small batches? And how do you, recognize prior learning? Because there are a lot of people out there who have prior learning and are mechanics or plumbers or carpenters, but they don't have a certification, right? So that's the real quantity challenge: large numbers, dispersed locations, small batch size, and very important, why should a person want to join a vocational training course? The aspiration is to get from school to college to obtain a degree and go forward. What's in it for me to actually do a vocational training program, and what's the aspirational quotient there? If you want to skill 500 million people, you want to set up a capacity of 50 million. If you take a student-teacher ratio of 1:25, you require 2 million trainers. Where are the trainers? Can you get 2 million trainers overnight? You can't. So can you challenge a student-teacher ratio? Can you take 1 trainer to 1,000, 2,000 people? Can you look at a new way of doing it? How do you get industry to recognize or an individual to recognize the assessment? And how do do you train a person for 2 years to get him to be a certain skill, or do you break it up into modules, and how do you accumulate learning? And how do you address the whole problem of quality? So if you focus on quality, you won't get the numbers. If you want the numbers, it's a trade-off with quality. And then you get the third dimension. How do you lower costs? How do you achieve the cost of training equal to 1 month's salary? And how do you actually, last presentation was very interesting, how do you maximize the delivery of a course for an individual? How do you actually reach a student population of 1? So there are many challenges, but what could be done going forward? And I think here academics, industry, and local non-governmental organizations and local government bodies have to actually work in partnership. There are multiple forms of interventions that are possible in the skill development front. This could be to build capacity, to set standards in curriculum, to leverage existing capacity, and really community-based interventions. Actually, skill development in India has moved from a push kind of a thing to what Professor just mentioned, to a demand-led skill development strategy. So how do you create a demand-led skill development strategy? The challenge was the lack of information. I mean, if you're in the US, you can go to OSTAR.net, you can look at what are the competencies required for various skills at various job levels, and you can actually see a red, green, or orange bar saying that people are hiring, people are not hiring, or it's a mixed kind of scenario. There's no such system in India. So what's that? That's really addressing the information asymmetry in terms of what job opportunities with what competencies are actually available in the market. People talk about this in exotic names. They talk about a labor market information system. They talk about electronification of employment exchanges. But really, so the first thing that NSDC did was we were asked to look at 20 sectors. So we got a consulting firm to do an analysis of what were the jobs that were required in those 20 sectors. And very interestingly, in those 20 sectors, the high growth sectors, they came up with that between 2008 and 2022, industry, if it were to grow at the rate that it was growing at 2008, 2008 was a little more difficult than the current scenario, because at that time we were into a full-blown recession, and governments were bailing out industry, and not the governments bailing out government, as is the case right now. So they said in these 20 industries, we require 244 million people. So we said, wow, and we put this information up on the net. What actually happened was entrepreneurs then said, okay, there are the companies in the automotive space that collectively want 35 million people over the next 10 years. There are people in the construction space who want 33 million people over the next 10 years. They found a demand-supply gap. Whenever there's a demand-supply gap and there's an economic model that can be created, entrepreneurs step in. So information on the net led to a new class of entrepreneurs who were called social entrepreneurs, and I believe yesterday Professor Yunus also talked about social entrepreneurship. So the first thing came about is that you require 244 million people. The second bit of information was the current capacity for skill development is 4.3 million. It has to go to 40 million. And we said that the different business models can be put up. So interestingly, we found that how do you actually get entrepreneurs to take risk in this space? So NSDC said, fine, we would fund two types of people. We would fund people who actually want to set up skill development centers, and we would also fund people who want to do technology interventions. So, again, we use the net. In the net, we put up our proposal forms, you can apply online, etc. And very interestingly, from 7th of May, or actually 24th of February, year before last, in 2009, till the 9th of December, we actually approved 38 proposals to set up training establishments that would possibly create a capacity of 11.7 million people and train 58 million people over the next 10 years. At a rough investment about $200 million or 110 crores, 1,010 crores of rupees. And the leverage that these companies would do would be about 80,000 crores or $20 billion going forward. Then what did we learn from these 38 partners who were actually in this space and wanting to actually work here? And what are the technological innovations that they were looking for? And that actually brings me to the meat of what I wanted to present and say that there is actually a technology and skill value chain. Right from the time you mobilize a person, you recognize prior learning, you take him through the training process, you do the assessment, you do the certification, you do the placement, you do the monitoring, you do an upskilling, and then again you create the aspirational quotient and you go around the skill value chain. And I'll take each one of these and say what could be the possible technology interventions that we are looking for. And I can only say that if we find interventions that work in this space, and if we find entrepreneurs who are actually willing to actually do this, funding is not an issue, as long as it's a sustainable business. So what about creating an aspirational quotient? The biggest problem in the skill development space, unlike college, MIT or a university, Delhi University has been in the news very recently where you saw 99% people being refused admission to a certain college. So there is always a surfeit or excess demand for the supply. But in most vocational training programs, the demand is not there. You have to cajole people, you have to tell them. So how do you actually create the aspirational quotient using technology? At one hand, people are borrowing money at 50-60% to go and do a training program that provides them a job at the end of it. On the other hand, people are not even aware of what training and what job is available. So what's the role of technology? Social media as we know it cannot reach the mass and the type of people that we want to reach in here. So what's the alternate mechanism that we actually look at? We have to look at TV and most importantly the mobile phone. How do we use the mobile phone as a means of creating an aspirational value into people, and how do we communicate and what do we do? There are examples of small pilots, but we need to scale them. The second is, how do we look at radio and the common service or citizen service centers that have been set up in the villages as a means to put communication and belief and get two-way interaction? And how do we create a business opportunity for the person who actually mans that? The training organizations want people. They'll be willing to pay actually for mobilizing people who would join a course and complete the course and take up a job. So there is an economic value in this whole space. What is missing is the technological application to enable this to happen at a very, very low cost. There are companies who have done media advertisements. They've spent 500,000 rupees in advertising, let's say in Mumbai, for giving free training to masons. They didn't even get 5 applications. So obviously the aspirational quotient has to be developed using a different kind of a technology intervention, reaching out to the parents and looking at different types of messaging. So the second thing is, once you actually create the aspirational quotient, how do you mobilize, right? And how do you enable the person to fund for it? Grameen Bank was a very interesting example of what they did with the mobile phone. Can you do that? Can you do that low-cost vocational loans? Everybody, including the organization that we are in, is focusing on education loans for graduates and for school. Nobody is focusing on an educational or a vocational loan as low as 5,000 rupees. How do you use technology, self-help groups, to actually reach and enable people to take unsecured loans of 5,000 rupees, not based on their current income, but based on their ability to earn after they have gone through this whole program? I know that UID is under there are different aspirations to it, but there are ways that you could actually create networks using technology, using other methodologies to actually enable the mobilization to go forward. This then brings it, okay, you've now got the person in. How do you recognize what the person already knows? If I were to take the auto mechanic space or the driver space, at least the driver has got a license, but a roadside mechanic does not have any certification. So can you build systems that enable them to actually give online or tests which could be captured and stored? How do you recognize prior learning? You take any field, and for the interest of time, I won't give any other example than the automotive. How do you digitize the outcome? And how do you enable online certification and remote assessment? I mean, that's what the technology could do for you. Everybody wants to join the IT industry. One of the challenges is how do you get the same aspirations for different industry segments as the IT industry has done for itself? I mean, given working an 10 to 8 shift on a retail floor versus working at a midnight thing on a BPO, people will choose the midnight option because it's more attractive. So how do you actually tell a person that you don't have the aptitude for this? How do you minimize the wastage of resources in doing intelligent systems, cloud-enabled aptitude tests, which actually do online counseling through a remote location, much like telemedicine? How about doing this in the skills space? The next thing is in training, and I'm aware of the fantastic work that has been done in this institution. The challenge is, how do you take a training, we heard the $40,000 a year is actually half than what it costs them to deliver. So if you actually were to deliver a welding course using all the electrodes, it would cost you close to 100,000 rupees to train a welder. Can you bring it down to 10,000 or 16,000? Okay. How do you, create the training simulation? There was a big discussion about simulators versus the intelligent labs, but how do you actually reduce the cost of this and then use a centralized system to be able to be accessed by multiple locations with very affordable network delivery? We think DTH is direct to home, right? When 4G came to Korea, the killer application was gaming. Could skill development be the killer application, and could DTH be direct to hand going forward? What will enable? You have smartphones that cost 1/5 of the cost of a tablet, right? Can you integrate projection equipment into the phone so that you can have one-to-many kind of a learning? So how do you get low-cost, affordable networks? VSAT is very expensive. How do you leverage IT technology and Wi-Fi and VoIP or whatever other technology and reduce the cost? It takes about 300,000 rupees to 500,000 rupees to set up a VSAT center. If you don't, if you amortize it over the number of students that you get, you're not going to not be able to reduce the cost of training. How do you actually get online tracing and tracking systems? One of the challenges, and the employer needs to know and the academics need to know. And this is the conflict between the employer and the academic. An academic would want to know whether the person has done his 800 hours of training, theory, and 1,200 hours of practice. And the employer will say, I don't know how many hours of training, theory, or practice you've done, but can you actually weld a joint 100 times, 100% correct, day on day, year after year? It is fascinating. An engineering student can get away with 68%, but a skilled welder or a bricklayer cannot. Imagine in your house that only 90% of the bricks have been laid correctly, or in every car that goes in, only 90% of the welds have been done, or it can't happen. But we tend to actually deride the skill kind of an initiative. How do we, there was a lot of talk about digital curriculum. But given India with, it's easy to do in a single language speaking thing. But there is technology now available where you can take one language independent set of pictures and have different languages, and you can choose whichever language you want to put onto the text. So how do we actually create language independent and language accessible and same language subtitling actually in the digital space to make this go forward? The challenge, I was walking in here, I saw the lovely machinery, and I want to spend a minute on a story. As one of the ways to improve the aspirational quotient in skills, there is a world skills competition. It was last held in October in London. And there are 48 skills, including hair and hair cutting and styling and fashion tech.
What, when, where, etc. They are well known. I would suggest you are in a place here in the university where some of your ideas can be put into practice, starting from now. Already there is a feeling, strong feeling, very practical feeling, and being also worked out here now in a small way. I would suggest this congregation should decide, and come down to the brass tack to do things from anywhere, any of the areas, as you suggested. It can be started, it should be started now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the very wonderful talk. It opened our eyes. I had just two thoughts or questions to you. One is, earlier days, there used to be, at least in Maharashtra, what are called Bara Balutedars, which were the equivalent of guilds. But somehow, later on, as the school systems developed, it became wrong to, let's say, start training a child when he's 6-year-old or 8-year-old. And many of these skills really require the child to be trained. His muscles need to be trained from that age onwards. A, what is your take on that? That is my question. B, most of the people who go for skill training, they have to get into self-employment because there are no employers for them, or very few employers. If you take 500 million skilled people, and even if, let's say, 5 were to be employed by one person, you would need 100 million employers or self-employers. So what is your view on that? Thank you.
Thank you for both those questions. I actually did not talk about one important aspect of NSDC work because I felt in what we are trying to do is not important. But NSDC has been mandated on the National Skills Policy to set up sector skill councils, which we're trying to replicate the guild system. So we set up an automotive sector skill council. So these sector skill councils will look at national occupation standards. For each occupation standard would determine the competencies that are required. And then they will get industry to hire people who are certified on a voluntary basis. Abroad it is done on a licensing basis, right? Here we're trying to do it on a voluntary basis. And also then industry would get the existing employers certified. So I didn't talk about that aspect, but it is not answering one of the two questions that you have raised. I believe the motor skills thing is very important, right? We have to look at this at the school level. We have not done that. There are many educationists here, many more experts. I'm only talking of what I have heard and learned. We have to get young kids to use their motor skills. I can only tell you from personal experience. A lot of my friends say I never studied because I played games. Okay, in my college, I played 3 games for college. I played 2 leagues in Delhi. But that experience, and I started very young. So it actually lent a different dimension to what I was doing. And we had clay modeling, we had carpentry, we had bookbinding. Those things have gone out of the school syllabus because of our quest to get good numbers and good degrees. So you have to get, the 5 motor skills have to actually be honed at a very young age. The other aspect, the other point that you raised, I can only talk from what we are trying to do. And that's 97% of India's workforce is unorganized. All right? What does technology do? What is Facebook? Facebook has actually organized the unorganized. So can you use technology to organize the unorganized, right? I mean, today, if you want to hire a carpenter, can you, in your home in Delhi, if my wife calls me up and I want a carpenter now, I have no means to, but technology enables that to happen. So if you use technology to organize the unorganized, there is something fantastic which this institution is doing. You're trying to revive the wood carving, design-led interventions, create markets, increase the group, create groups. So you can use technology to organize the unorganized, and that's the real going forward. If you're going to say we're going to get 100 million companies employing 5 people, not going to happen.